I want to talk now a little bit about what inspired me to edit the book, Good Things Out of Nazareth. There were several things that happened. I had embarked on a teaching career mostly outside of the South. I was teaching literature at a small college in the Midwest in the early 80s and after I'd gotten out of graduate school. And O'Connor is a really tough person to teach to people who are unfamiliar with the Southern setting, the Southern dialect, some of the Southern phrasing in her stories, her sense of humor, and I found this to be the case in Michigan. So in order, and also just the sheer violence of her stories, the bizarre character of her stories was a really hard for some of the young students that I was teaching in Michigan to understand. So in 1979, of course, O'Connor's seminal collection, which my collection, Good Things Out of Nazareth, commemorates its 40th year after it was published. My book was published. But the 79 book was The Habit of Being, which is a classic of American letters. And I discovered that changed the teaching of O'Connor because I was able to teach the letters after 1979 in which O'Connor, another voice appears. In some cases, it's a voice that explains to the reader what she intended in some of her most violent stories. Like A Good Man Is Hard to Find, she explains that, or the story about the woman who's gored in the pasture, which is kind of a takeoff on Death in the Afternoon by Ernest Hemingway. That story about bullfighting. O'Connor had her own version of that, but people really didn't know what to make of that story. And she explains that story, what it meant in her letters. So the letters in 79, I think revolutionized, at least for me, teaching O'Connor. So that occurred, and also the letters volume, it had a personal aspect to it, and that is to say, my mother was one of these, she's deceased now, but she was one of these elderly admirers of Southern writers and Southern historians, but she could never warm to the stories of Flannery O'Connor. But when the letters themselves came out in 1979, she was taken by the letters because it was another voice. It was it's a much more endearing, kind of charitable voice than you find in the stories. And so my mother and I used to have long conversations about The Habit of Being. And she said, I can't read the stories, but I understand now. I understand her much better, and I am devoted to the letters, and I like the letters. And so my mother kind of became a fan of O'Connor, and she said, I can understand why you teach her. So this was in what? Through the 80s, I was teaching O'Connor, supplemented by the letters. And then I had heard at some point it seems I was on sabbatical, actually. And I had heard in 1999 or 2000 that there were quite a few letters that were not collected or had been left out of The Habit of Being. So what I did, I began to try to find out where these letters were. I went on a number of research trips, and I will never forget the one research trip that forever stands out in my mind. This was June, I think, of 2000. It was a very, very hot day, and I had heard that O'Connor's letters from her Jesuit, sometimes spiritual director and good friend, the Reverend James Hart McCown, or as they called him, Hootie, that these letters were collected in a at Duke University. So I went there one hot summer afternoon and actually found the letters. I read them and I was just amazed at what I found there, mainly because it was the letters of one of her good friends who was very much underrepresented in the habit of being, one of her Jesuit friends, this Father McCown. And within the letters were a number of other friends of O'Connor that were underrepresented or underpublished in the habit of being. So that hot summer afternoon, I Xeroxed madly, and that's where the idea of this book was generated. But something else happened that afternoon that made it very, very memorable to me. And 8 miles away was, of course, the University of North Carolina. And I had heard that there were letters from O'Connor's famous teacher, and I'd also done some research and found that there were letters of Carolyn Gordon there to who's O'Connor's teacher, to O'Connor's friend Walker Percy, as well as several other people, namely Ward Allison Durrance, who's a French professor at Georgetown. So that afternoon in June 2000, I went over there and I fell out of my chair again. This was an incredible experience in one day. I found the letters of Carolyn Gordon to Walker Percy, author of The Movie Gore. These were long, some of the letters 18 pages long, in which she is, as she did with O'Connor, went line by line through his fiction. This was before he wrote The Movie Gore. She was advising him on another book. So I was incredibly excited. I Xeroxed madly. I left there with a folder full of original letters, and I determined at that point, although I didn't have a title for the book, but I was determined at that point to publish the letters. And why was I determined to publish the letters? First, you find in the letters a network of Jesuit friends, priests, who up until this point were not that well known. This is Father McCown, James McCown, his brother Robert McCown, who has studied with C.S. Lewis at Oxford, and a very learned philosophic Jesuit who wrote some of the greatest things on the violent burial way, Father Scott Watson. They were in these letters. So I was determined to recognize this new set of friends. There are many others that I discovered, but I wanted to recognize this new set of friends. And then another thing occurred to me as I looked at those letters. These letters were collected by a professor from Wake Forest. He's deceased now, Thomas F. Gossett. And Gossett was a person who wanted to be the first person to publish any O'Connor letters. And he was collecting them and preparing them for publication. And all of a sudden, I think unknown to him, he was superseded by Sally Fitzgerald, who edited The Habit of Being. But Thomas F. Gossett actually was the original collector of the O'Connor letters, and he wanted and anticipated, wanted to get this collection out first, but somehow he was beat to the punch by Sally Fitzgerald in 1979. So I wanted to do something in behalf of what Thomas F. Gossett, I wanted to recognize him. And so that's how these letters came into being, how I came to edit them, and how I found them sort of in a providential act of research one summer afternoon in 1990.